On the surface, it represented the American entrepreneurial dream. A mid-market manufacturing firm generating $17 million in annual revenue, a 23-year marriage, 2 Ivy League children. The facade was meticulously maintained through country club memberships, philanthropic board positions, and quarterly earnings that satisfied both investors and the family legacy. But beneath the polished corporate veneer, a CEO was executing 2 parallel operations, so romantic, one financial that would ultimately converge into a single, catastrophic exposure. This is not a story about infidelity. This is a case study in how personal betrayal became the entry point to uncovering systematic corporate fraud. Now, let's open the case file and deconstruct the plan. The wife discovered the affair through a pattern familiar to anyone who has studied information security breaches: a compromised device. A forgotten iPad, still logged into her husband's iCloud account, began receiving message notifications in real time. The correspondence revealed an 18-month relationship with the company's business development manager, a woman 15 years his junior, who had joined the firm during an expansion phase. The initial reaction followed a predictable trajectory: shock, anger, the instinct to confront. But what separated this case from countless others was the wife's professional background. She held an MBA in corporate finance and had served as the company's CFO during its early growth phase before stepping back to raise their children. Rather than immediately escalating to confrontation, she initiated what would become a 30-day silent reconnaissance operation. She accessed shared financial accounts. She reviewed corporate tax returns stored in their home office. She examined expense reports and travel manifests that her husband had carelessly left unsecured. And in this initial review, something emerged that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of her response. The personal betrayal was undeniable, but the numbers told a more complex story, one that suggested the affair was merely a symptom of a far more consequential pattern of deception. The conventional narrative would position the wife and the mistress as adversaries, 2 women competing for the same man's attention, resources, and commitment. The stage was set for exactly the kind of emotional spectacle that reduces complex human situations to simplistic conflict. But this case would not follow that script. The discovery mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. While conducting what began as a personal audit documenting marital assets for divorce preparation, the wife identified a discrepancy in the corporate quarterly statements. A vendor payment of $240,000 to a consulting firm she had never encountered during her tenure as CFO. The listed service: strategic market analysis. She cross-referenced the payment against the company's client acquisition data for that quarter. No correlation, no deliverable, no contract on file. This single anomaly became the investigative thread. She requested access to the company's financial records under the premise of reviewing estate planning documents, a request her husband had no legal grounds to deny given their joint ownership structure. What she uncovered over the next 2 weeks constituted a masterclass in corporate embezzlement architecture. The consulting firm existed only on paper, registered in Delaware with her husband listed as the sole beneficial owner through a series of layered LLCs. The $240,000 was not an isolated incident. It represented one entry in a systematic diversion scheme that had been operational for at least 7 years. The pattern was consistent: quarterly payments ranging from $180,000 to $300,000, always categorized as consulting fees, marketing expenses, or technology upgrades. The funds flowed from the family business into shell entities, then dispersed across multiple personal accounts: real estate purchases, luxury vehicle leases, and offshore investment vehicles. The total diversion exceeded $4.2 million. This was not impulsive theft. This was engineered fraud, executed with the confidence of someone who believed their position as CEO and majority equity holder placed them beyond accountability. But the investigation revealed a second, more disturbing dimension. The business development manager, the Mistress, had not been a passive participant in the affair. Her hiring coincided precisely with the escalation of the embezzlement scheme. Her signature appeared on multiple fraudulent vendor contracts. Her corporate email had been used to communicate with the shell company administrators. Whether she was a willing collaborator or a manipulated accomplice remained unclear, but her evidentiary proximity to the fraud was undeniable. Here, we see the critical pivot. The wife's initial motivation had been personal, documentation for divorce proceedings, but the evidence now in her possession transcended marital dissolution. She held proof of federal crimes-wire fraud, tax evasion, shareholder deception. The company employed 47 people. It had fiduciary obligations to minority investors. The embezzlement had artificially suppressed profit distributions and devalued the firm's legitimate equity. This was no longer about a marriage. This was about systematic theft from a corporate entity, from employees whose retirement accounts were tied to company performance, from investors who had trusted the financial statements. The conventional path would have been immediate exposure. Contact law enforcement, file for divorce, let the criminal justice system proceed. But that path carried significant risk. A criminal investigation would freeze corporate assets, potentially destroying the business and eliminating its value entirely. The wife faced a strategic calculation: pursue justice through conventional channels and watch the company collapse, or leverage the evidence to architect an alternative resolution. The decision required a partner, and the only person with comparable exposure to the fraud, with equal motivation to act, and with internal corporate access, was the woman she had every conventional reason to consider an enemy. The initial contact was conducted through corporate channels, deliberately avoiding any communication that could be construed as collusion or conspiracy. The wife requested a meeting with the business development manager under the pretext of discussing transition planning, framing it as a professional courtesy given the inevitable corporate restructuring that would follow divorce proceedings. The meeting location was selected for strategic neutrality, a conference room at the firm's outside legal counsel, with the attorney present as a witness to ensure all discussions remained within legal boundaries. The opening gambit was direct. The wife presented a single document, the Delaware LLC registration showing the CEO's ownership of the Shell consulting firm. No accusation, no emotional confrontation. Simply evidence, laid on the table between them. The business development manager's response would determine whether the next phase was possible. She could deny involvement, claim ignorance, or attempt to protect the CEO. Instead, after a 17-second pause that the attorney later described as the longest silence I've witnessed in mediation, she made a different calculation. She acknowledged her signature on the fraudulent contracts. She confirmed she had been told the consulting firm was a legitimate vendor providing competitive intelligence services. She revealed that she had raised questions about the arrangement 8 months prior, only to be told that tax optimization strategies were standard practice at this revenue level. And crucially, she disclosed something the wife's audit had not yet uncovered. The CEO had recently pressured her to sign off on an even larger transaction, $750,000 technology infrastructure upgrade to a vendor she could not verify. She had refused. The relationship had deteriorated immediately afterward. Here, we see the fundamental strategic pivot that distinguishes this case. The conventional narrative positions these two women as rivals in a zero-sum competition. But that framework serves only the CEO's interest. It keeps them isolated, reactive, and focused on each other rather than on the systemic fraud. The wife recognized what many in similar situations fail to grasp. The mistress was not the architect of the betrayal. She was a second victim of the same pattern of manipulation, one who had been strategically positioned to provide legitimacy to financial crimes while being denied full information about their scope. The alliance was formalized not through emotional reconciliation that would come later, if at all, but through a shared strategic analysis. Both women faced the same threat. If the embezzlement was exposed through conventional criminal prosecution, the company would likely be destroyed in the process, eliminating any equity value and potentially exposing the business development manager to charges as an accessory. But if the evidence could be leveraged as negotiating pressure rather than criminal evidence, it could force a different outcome entirely. The strategic framework they developed over the next 6 weeks represents a sophisticated application of what we might call evidence-based coercion architecture. The goal was not punishment for its own sake. The goal was a forced equity transfer, 100% ownership surrendered to avoid criminal prosecution while preserving the operational integrity of the business itself. This required 3 parallel work streams. The first work stream was forensic completion. The initial audit had identified 4.2 million in diversions, but the strategic value of the evidence depended on its comprehensiveness. They retained a forensic accounting firm under attorney-client privilege, positioning the engagement as divorce preparation. The forensic team expanded the analysis across 10 years of corporate records, ultimately documenting 6.8 million in fraudulent transfers. More importantly, they traced the fund flows through multiple jurisdictions, identifying tax evasion violations that would trigger both state and federal prosecution. They documented 18 separate instances where fraudulent expenses had been used to reduce corporate tax liability, each instance representing a distinct count of tax fraud. The second workstream was legal architecture. They needed a mechanism that would allow for equity transfer without triggering gift tax implications, minority shareholder disputes, or corporate dissolution requirements. The solution was elegant: a structured resignation and redemption agreement. The CEO would voluntarily resign all positions, surrender all equity interests to the company for redemption at a nominal value justified by the massive liability he had created, and the redeemed shares would then be redistributed to the wife as part of the marital dissolution and to the business development manager as compensation for her cooperation in uncovering the fraud. The legal team drafted the entire transaction package in advance, ready for immediate execution. The third workstream was leverage calibration. The evidence had to be presented in a way that made the threat of criminal prosecution absolutely credible, while simultaneously offering a clear exit path. They prepared 3 versions of the same evidence package. Version 1: a detailed whistleblower submission to the IRS, formatted to meet all requirements for reward consideration and including a preliminary calculation of tax revenue recovery. Version 2: a criminal complaint to the FBI's white-collar crime division with specific federal statute violations cited. Version 3: a civil lawsuit on behalf of minority shareholders alleging breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent financial statements, and corporate waste. The psychological architecture was equally calculated. The CEO had operated for years under the assumption that his position granted him immunity, that his wife lacked the financial sophistication to detect the fraud, that the business development manager was sufficiently compromised to remain silent, and that even if discovered, his majority equity position would allow him to control the narrative. The alliance shattered all 3 assumptions simultaneously, but the most critical element of the strategy was timing and information control. They established a 48-hour window for decision-making. The CEO would be presented with the evidence package and the pre-drafted equity transfer agreement simultaneously. He would have exactly 2 business days to execute the transfer, or the 3 evidence packages would be filed concurrently with federal authorities, state regulators, and the civil court system. No negotiation. No alternative offers. A binary choice: surrender the equity or face prosecution that would result in both prison time and complete financial destruction through legal fees, penalties, and restitution orders. The leverage was absolute because the evidence was irrefutable. This was not about he said, she said testimony. This was bank records, forged contracts, email communications, and tax returns documentation that would survive any legal challenge. When we analyze the strategic sophistication of this approach, we see how evidence quality transforms bargaining power. The alliance did not need to rely on emotional appeals or moral arguments. They simply needed to make the mathematical calculation obvious: surrender the equity and preserve personal freedom, or maintain ownership and spend the next decade in federal prison. The execution meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning at 9 a.m. in the conference room of the firm's outside legal counsel. The CEO was informed only that it concerned urgent corporate governance matters requiring immediate attention. He arrived expecting a routine discussion, possibly related to the divorce proceedings he knew were inevitable. Instead, he found himself facing his wife, the business development manager, 2 attorneys, and a forensic accountant. The presentation lasted 12 minutes. No preamble, no emotional appeals. The forensic accountant displayed the evidence on a mounted screen. Shell company registrations, bank transfer records, forged contracts, tax return discrepancies, $6.8 million across 10 years, traced through multiple accounts and entities, 18 separate federal tax violations, wire fraud across state lines, securities fraud through false financial statements provided to minority investors. Each allegation was supported by documentary evidence that had already been verified by the forensic team. The lead attorney then presented the 3 prepared evidence packages, physically placing them on the conference table. The IRS whistleblower submission, formatted and ready for filing. The FBI criminal complaint with specific statute citations. The minority shareholder civil lawsuit with calculated damages exceeding $12 million when treble damages and attorney fees were included. The attorney explained that all 3 packages were date-stamped and prepared for simultaneous electronic filing. Then came the alternative, the pre-drafted equity transfer agreement. The CEO would immediately resign all corporate positions. He would surrender 100% of his equity interest for redemption at $1 a nominal consideration, justified by the massive liability he had created and the legal exposure he was eliminating through voluntary cooperation. The redeemed equity would be redistributed, 70% to the wife through the divorce settlement, 30% to the business development manager as compensation for her cooperation and her agreement not to pursue wrongful termination or whistleblower claims. The agreement included a comprehensive non-disclosure clause and a prohibition on future involvement in the industry. The deadline was absolute, 5 p.m. Friday, 48 hours. Sign the equity transfer or the 3 evidence packages would be filed electronically at 5:01 p.m., triggering federal investigation, criminal prosecution, and civil litigation simultaneously. No counteroffers would be considered, no extensions would be granted. The binary choice was deliberately structured to eliminate negotiation leverage. The CEO's initial response followed a predictable pattern: denial, anger, threats of his own legal action. He claimed the evidence was manufactured. He threatened to destroy the business rather than surrender it. He accused both women of conspiracy and attempted extortion. The lead attorney allowed him to exhaust this response, then calmly clarified the legal distinction. Extortion involves demanding something to which you have no legitimate claim. The wife had legitimate claim to marital assets. The business development manager had legitimate claim to compensation for documented corporate misconduct. The equity transfer agreement simply formalized these legitimate claims while offering him the opportunity to avoid criminal prosecution. The meeting concluded at 9:47 a.m. The CEO was provided with a copy of all evidence and the transfer agreement. He was informed that any attempt to destroy evidence, transfer assets, or obstruct the process would be immediately reported to federal authorities and would eliminate the opportunity for settlement. He left the conference room without signing. The next 36 hours represented the most volatile phase of the execution. The alliance maintained absolute information control, monitoring corporate accounts for any unusual activity. They had already secured preliminary injunctions preventing asset transfers above $10,000 without court approval. They had notified the company's bank of potential fraudulent activity, triggering enhanced scrutiny of any withdrawal attempts. They had filed the divorce petition, which automatically imposed legal restrictions on marital asset disposition. At 2:30 p.m., Friday 2.5 hours before the deadline, the CEO's attorney contacted the outside counsel. His client was prepared to execute the agreement. The signing occurred at 4:15 p.m. in the same conference room, this time with a court reporter present to create an official record. The CEO signed 7 documents: the resignation letter, the equity redemption agreement, the divorce settlement incorporating the equity transfer, the non-disclosure agreement, the non-compete agreement, the release of all corporate claims, and an affidavit acknowledging that his decision was made voluntarily without coercion. By 5:30 p.m., the executed documents had been filed with the corporate registry, the divorce court, and the company's registered agent. The ownership transfer was complete and irrevocable. The CEO departed the building, having surrendered an equity stake that had been valued at $9 million in the most recent corporate valuation. He retained nothing except the elimination of criminal prosecution risk-and, even that remained contingent on his continued compliance with the agreement's terms. The takedown was complete. The execution had proceeded with the clinical precision of a leveraged buyout, except the leverage was not financial capital but evidentiary documentation and the credible threat of federal prosecution. The alliance had transformed proof of crime into a mechanism for forced equity transfer, achieving through strategic pressure what would have required years of litigation and potentially destroyed the business in the process. The aftermath unfolded across multiple dimensions, each revealing the strategic superiority of evidence-based leverage over conventional litigation. The CEO's immediate financial position deteriorated rapidly. Having surrendered all equity for nominal consideration, he faced immediate liquidity constraints. The luxury vehicles were returned to lessors. The offshore investment accounts, now exposed through the forensic audit, became subject to tax authority scrutiny that would continue for years. The real estate holdings purchased with diverted funds were sold to cover mounting legal fees not from criminal defense, which the settlement had eliminated, but from tax attorneys navigating the IRS examinations that inevitably followed the discovery of unreported income. More significantly, the non-compete clause effectively ended his career in the industry. The agreement prohibited him from any involvement in manufacturing, consulting, or business development within the sector for 7 years. At 52 years old, with a professional reputation now quietly circulated among industry networks as someone who had been forced to resign and surrender equity, his employment options narrowed to roles far beneath his previous status. The settlement had achieved what criminal prosecution often fails to deliver: complete economic consequences without the delays and uncertainties of trial. The company itself underwent a strategic restructuring under new leadership. The wife assumed the CEO position, leveraging her earlier experience as CFO and her comprehensive understanding of the firm's financial architecture. The business development manager was promoted to chief operating officer, her institutional knowledge proving invaluable during the transition. Together, they implemented enhanced financial controls, engaged external auditors for quarterly reviews, and restructured vendor relationships to eliminate the vulnerabilities that had enabled the fraud. Within 18 months, the company's profitability increased by 23% not through revenue growth, but through the elimination of the systematic diversions that had artificially suppressed performance. The minority shareholders received their first accurate financial statements in a decade and saw their equity values appreciate accordingly. Employee retirement accounts, tied to company performance, benefited from the improved earnings. The fraud had not only stolen from the owners, it had stolen from every person whose financial future was connected to the firm's legitimate success. The alliance between the two women evolved beyond strategic necessity into a functional partnership built on mutual respect. They had entered the collaboration as reluctant allies united by shared threat. They emerged as partners who had demonstrated that complex problems require sophisticated solutions, and that the conventional narratives of rivalry often obscure more effective paths to justice. When we analyze this case through the framework of strategic deconstruction, several principles become clear. First, evidence quality determines leverage magnitude. The forensic documentation was so comprehensive and irrefutable that it eliminated all negotiation space. The CEO faced a binary choice with no middle ground. Second, timing compression forces decision-making. The 48-hour deadline prevented the CEO from organizing counter-strategies or attempting asset concealment. Third, alliance formation multiplies strategic options. Separately, each woman faced limited choices and significant risks. Together, they created an architecture that preserved business value while achieving complete accountability. The case demonstrates that justice need not follow conventional paths to be effective. Criminal prosecution would have taken years, cost millions in legal fees, and potentially destroyed the business that employed 47 people. The leveraged equity transfer achieved comprehensive consequences in 48 hours while preserving the enterprise's operational integrity. This is not about revenge. is about strategic optimization of outcomes when the evidence supports absolute leverage. The blueprint exists in corporate registries, forensic reports, and executed agreements. The lesson transcends the specific case. When evidence is irrefutable and leverage is absolute, strategic pressure can force outcomes that litigation cannot guarantee. The two women did not simply survive betrayal. They architected a resolution that transformed victimhood into ownership, converted fraud into accountability, and proved that the most sophisticated justice is often delivered not through courtrooms, but through conference rooms where evidence meets strategy and documentation becomes power.